Ever get hit with those like really big questions, the ones that leave you kind of staring into the void? Like what happens after we die? Or is this universe just one giant cosmic bubble? Well, turns out you and the Buddha, yeah, you heard that right, the Buddha, have that in common. Today we're diving deep, and I mean deep, into some seriously thought-provoking Buddhist philosophy, the kind that'll really make you think. We're talking about questions even the Buddha himself left unanswered.
Yeah, and it's pretty amazing when you think about it, right? In Buddhism, they have this whole concept of unanswerable questions.
Unanswerable questions. So are they like unsolvable riddles? Or are we talking about something totally different?
Well, it's not that they're completely unanswerable. It's more like
Like,
they're best approached in a different way. They're pointing us towards something, but not in a way we might expect.
okay, I'm intrigued. Give us a picture here. What kind of questions are we talking about?
All right, so imagine this. You're a student, super eager to learn, sitting right there with the Buddha himself.
Talk about an amazing opportunity.
Right, you're expecting these huge, universe-shattering revelations. But on certain topics, he just stays silent.
He just clams up. The Buddha!
Exactly. And it's not just random either. We see this in both major branches of Buddhism. Like in Mahayana Buddhism, they have these 14 unanswerable questions.
14. Someone was keeping track.
Oh yeah, they get very specific. Some of them dive into the really big picture stuff like, is the universe infinite? Or even wilder, does a Buddha keep existing in some form after death? Like what happens to all that enlightened energy?
Whoa! So we're talking about questions that have probably been debated for centuries.
Exactly. And the fact that they're still pondered today just shows how deeply they resonate with something, fundamental to the human experience.
That desire to understand the really big, maybe even scary stuff.
Totally. And in the Theravada tradition, there's a text called the Kula Malinkyavada Sutta.
Catchy title.
Right. It's all about this monk who gets so fixated on these big questions that it's actually distracting him from his meditation. It's like he thinks if he can just grasp this one thing, he'll have it all figured out.
Oh, I know that feeling. Getting so caught up in the search for answers that you forget to just, be.
Exactly. And the Buddha, he shuts that whole line of thinking down hard.
He does. Why so blunt? I mean, it's a good question, right?
It is. But the Buddha's being intentional here. He's highlighting this really crucial point. Don't get stuck in endless intellectual debates.
So it's not just about having the right answer.
Nope. Remember, the goal in Buddhism is to escape suffering.
Right? To reach enlightenment.
And you achieve that through practice, through actual experience, not just by theorizing.
Ah, so it's less talk, more action.
Exactly. And the Buddha, he illustrates this with a really powerful analogy. Imagine yourself trapped in a burning building.
Oh, man. I'm already getting anxious just thinking about it.
Right. So you're in this burning building. Would you waste time debating the origin of the fire? Or would you just focus on escaping?
Yeah, escaping seems like a good priority in that scenario.
Exactly. So the Buddha's saying that getting hung up on those big metaphysical questions, it's like arguing about the fire while the house is burning down around you.
So instead of getting lost in the why, we should focus on the what now.
Focus on what truly matters. Escaping suffering.
All right, so the Buddha's silence isn't about him withholding some secret knowledge. It's actually a teaching in itself.
Now you're getting it. And this is where the idea of silence as a teaching comes into play.
Hold on a sec. So the lack of an answer, that's the answer. Like I say, my mind's a little blown right now.
Yeah, it can be pretty radical when you first encounter it, huh? Instead of grabbing onto those fixed ideas about the universe, especially the ones that might be making us suffer, clinging to them, the Buddha's saying, what if we just let go?
Let go! Just like
Embrace the unknown, right? See it as a path to liberation, which is what the Buddha was trying to show us all along, I think.
Okay, yeah, I can kind of see that. But wouldn't that be frustrating for some people? The ones who just need a concrete answer to grab onto. Did anyone ever try to tackle these unanswerable questions head on?
Oh, absolutely. Buddhist thinkers have been going back and forth about these questions for literally centuries.
No kidding. So who are some of the big names?
Take Nagarjuna, for example.
Nagarjuna.
He was a really influential guy in Mahayana Buddhism, and he had this fascinating take on the whole thing. Basically, he argued that the Buddha wasn't actually picking sides. He wasn't saying the universe is this way or it isn't that way.
So what was he saying then?
He was pointing out the limitations of language, and logic when you try to talk about ultimate reality.
Oh, I get it. Like,
Yeah.
we're using these clumsy tools to try to explain something way beyond our grasp.
Exactly. Nagarjuna was all about showing how we get trapped by our own ways of thinking, those conceptual boxes we put ourselves in.
Okay, so I'm hearing you say that the Buddha didn't necessarily have no opinions on these big questions.
Right.
Right. It's not that he didn't have opinions. Remember that analogy with the burning building?
Yeah, get out of the burning building.
Right. The Buddha, he was like a master at meeting people where they were at. He knew when to offer some really specific advice and when to kind of nudge people towards a different understanding.
So it's not always about finding the right answer. Exactly. It's more about recognizing that these questions, they're like opportunities. Opportunities for a totally different way of looking at things, a way that can help us escape suffering and understand ourselves and the universe in a more profound way. And that understanding, it doesn't come from clinging to any one answer, but from the journey itself.
So the journey is more important than the destination.
You got it. It's like, imagine you're working on a really complex puzzle.
I love puzzles.
You could be laser focused on finding that one missing piece. Or you could kind of relax into the process, appreciate the intricate patterns, and you might even discover something new about the whole picture that way.
So instead of stressing about the end goal, we should be enjoying the process of getting there.
Now you're really getting it. And this whole idea, this willingness to be okay with not knowing, it applies to way more than just these questions the Buddha left open.
Yeah.
It becomes like this guiding principle for how we should approach all the big questions in life.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? How do we balance that very human need for answers with this idea of accepting the unknown?
That's where the three marks of existence come in. Anicca, dukkha, anatta.
Right, those core Buddhist teachings, impermanence, suffering, and no self. But how do those concepts help us, especially when we're dealing with these huge existential questions?
Okay, so think of it like this. The three marks, they're not meant to be answers in and of themselves. They're more like tools,
Tools.
Yeah, like if you're venturing out into uncharted territory, they're like a compass and a map to help guide you.
Instead of giving us the answers outright, they give us a new way of approaching the questions, a new perspective to see things from.
Exactly. For example, if we can really wrap our heads around impermanence, that everything changes, nothing stays the same, then it becomes a bit easier to let go of needing those fixed, unchanging answers.
Because if everything's always in motion, trying to define it with one answer is impossible, right?
Yeah. Like trying to catch a wave in your hand, it's just not going to happen.
So it's less about knowing and more about understanding.
Exactly. And that understanding, that way of seeing things through the lens of impermanence, suffering, and non-self, can actually be incredibly freeing. We can approach those big questions with curiosity, with openness, instead of being afraid and needing certainty all the time.
It's like by letting go of the need to control the answers, to force them to be something specific, we actually free ourselves.
Now you're really getting it. And that's a huge part of what Buddhism's all about.
So it's like, even if we don't actually figure out the answers to these unanswerable questions, just by thinking about them, by wrestling with them, we start to see things differently, right? Like we're breaking free from old ways of thinking.
Absolutely. It's about letting go of those rigid views, opening ourselves up to a reality that might be way bigger and more mysterious than we can even imagine. And Buddhism often suggests that this kind of open exploration, it's actually more helpful for spiritual growth than just clinging to one answer.
So it's more about the journey than the destination. Like, would you say that what's being encouraged here is more of a sense of curiosity? Just a willingness to sit with the uncertainty instead of having to force an answer?
100%. It's almost like the Buddha's inviting us to get comfortable with not knowing, which, let's face it, can be a pretty tough thing for us humans to do. We like our certainties.
We really do. It's like we're wired to crave those concrete answers.
But maybe, just maybe, that craving is part of what keeps us stuck.
Okay, so how do we actually apply this in our lives, here in the 21st century? I mean, we can't just throw up our hands and say, well, the Buddha didn't know, so I guess it's hopeless.
Right. Not at all. It's not about giving up on searching for knowledge. It's more about understanding that real, true understanding might exist beyond the way we think right now. Like maybe our brains just aren't quite equipped to grasp it fully.
So we need to upgrade our mental software.
Something like that. It's about cultivating a mind that's open, curious, and willing to admit when it's wrong.
So the real question isn't what are the answers? It's more like, how can I even begin to approach these questions in a way that helps me understand more and maybe even get a little closer to that freedom from suffering that Buddhism talks about?
You nailed it. And honestly, that is a question worth thinking about.
It really is a question for all of us. If even the Buddha was open to not knowing, Well, maybe we should be too. And it's funny, isn't it, how we're so drawn to those mysteries, those things we can't quite grasp. Actually, one listener wrote in specifically about that, wondering about it in the context of, well, Buddhism.
Yeah.
So today we're diving into something that might just change how you see those big, maybe even unanswerable questions.
Interesting. A different perspective is always good.
It really is. Okay. So we're looking at basically it's like a Q&A format, and it's all about why Buddha himself, wouldn't answer certain types of questions.
It's a concept known as asinteya. Essentially, there are questions that are considered beyond the limits of human intellect. Not because there isn't an answer, but because the questions themselves come from a misunderstanding of reality.
So not that Buddha was trying to be difficult or evasive, but that the whole line of questioning was like off base.
That's a great way to put it, and this is where another key Buddhist concept comes in, the three marks of existence.
Right. Impermanence, suffering, and non-self, like Buddhism 101, but always good to revisit.
Exactly. And Buddha argued that if you truly internalize these three marks, some of those big questions just dissolve.
Dissolve. Okay, now you're losing me a little. Can we get an example in here?
Of course. Imagine someone really worried about reincarnation asks, will I be reborn? If we're attached to a solid idea of me, that question feels huge. But if we understand that everything, including the self, is impermanent.
Then the idea of me being reborn doesn't really hold up, right?
Exactly. It's like asking the color of jealousy. The question itself is flawed.
Wow. That is a mind-bending concept. So it's not about getting the answer, but shifting your perspective so the question, it just loses its power.
Yes. And there's this great quote from Sarah Lamuni. It essentially says that dwelling on such questions only leads to a bunch of wrong views. So instead of getting lost in where did the universe come from or what happens after I die, Buddhism encourages us to look inward to find the answers.
Investigate what we can know, like suffering, which, sadly, none of us are strangers to, right? And when we do that, that's when we can find some clarity.
That's the path to enlightenment, to liberation from suffering.
This whole idea is making me think, what are some questions I cling to that might fit into this unanswerable category? What assumptions am I making without even realizing it? Something to ponder for sure.
Definitely.
And for you listening, what about you? What deeply held questions come to mind? Maybe if we look at them through the lens of impermanence, suffering, and non-self, we'll find our perspective shifting in ways we never expected. Until next time, keep exploring those big questions. But remember, sometimes the real journey is in understanding the question itself.